Kathy, Kazoo, Switcheroo, anyone but me. Chapter 1. I've got it. I've got it. The football sword like toward Kathy Carol. She ran toward the board, reached out her hands, and ooh, she missed it completely. You took your eyes off it again, Cassie's best friend Jeremy Fox said, jogging up to her. She pushed his thin white glasses higher up on his nose and ran his hands through his curly brown hair. I know, Kathy replied simply. What else could she say? Kathy, I can't believe you did that, Kevin Camerari shouted across the field. You lost the whole game for us. Just then George Brennan came charging across the field. He had a big smile on his face. Kathy groaned. Of course, George was happy. His team has just won the game, thanks to Kathy's bumper. Don't yell at the secret weapon, George told Kevin. Secret weapon? Are you kidding? Kevin asked. Secret weapon have win games, George. Exactly, George agreed. Kathy is the secret weapon for our team. Kathy blinked her eye tight. She didn't want George to see her cry. Forget about George, Jeremy whispered to Kathy. He can't help being mean. He was just born that way. Kathy tried to smile. Could it be, she said. The truth was, Kathy wasn't really sure why George was nasty to everyone in Class 3A. Most new kids try to make friends. Not George. He tried to make enemies. Just then, Kathy's other best friend, Susan Rock, ran across the playground to them. Let's go play on the monkey. Monkey bars for a while, she suggested, pulling Kathy and Jeremy away from George. I will bet I can't hang upside down longer than either of you. Kathy stared at Susan. Her friend was wearing a skirt. You're going to turn upside down in that? Kathy asked. Sure, Susan said, yanking her skirt up to her belly button. Kathy's mouth flew open. Jeremy blushed. It's okay, you guys. Susan laughed. See, I'm wearing shorts under here. This way I can wear a skirt and still play. Kathy laughed. Leave it to Susan to find a way to look pretty and still hang upside down on the jungle gym. Okay, last one at the monkey bar is a little egg. Kathy called it as she dashed away. Kathy held on to her lead, but not for long. Jeremy was the fastest runner in the class. He quickly pulled up next to Kathy. Kathy took a deep breath. She moved her feet faster than ever. But not fast enough. Jeremy zoomed into the lead. Kathy frowned. Well, at least she was ahead of Susan. Kathy turned her head to see just how far behind Susan was and splat! Kathy stepped right into a big wet puddle. Gushy brown mud splashed all over her. Kathy stopped running and looked down at her jeans. Oh, no, she cried out. What a mess. Kathy wasn't kidding. She was a total mess. There were mud splattered all over her jeans. Her favorite jeans, the one with the pink and blue flower embroidered all over them. If this were first grade, Kathy couldn't have changed into the clean clothes in her cubby, but Kathy was in third grade now. Nobody in third grade have a change of clothes at school. That was for babies. Kathy was going to have to wear her mud-stained jeans for the whole rest of the day. Nice one, Carol, Georgie shouted across the yard. Check it out, everybody. There's a mud monster in the playground. George stuck his arms straight out and walked around the yard, pretending to be Frankenstein. The other kids laughed. Kathy wanted to cry. This was the worst recess ever. She wished Mrs. Darkman would blow her whistle and make everyone go into class. Even doing schoolwork had to be better than this. George, go away, or I'm gonna tell. Susan warned as she ran over to defend her friend. A big smile formed on George's chubby round face. Yep, like I'm real scared. he rapped while he pretended to tremble. What's Mrs. Jerkman going to do? Call my mommy? Kathy and Susan stared at George in amazement. He just called his teacher, Mrs. Darkman, a mean name, and he hadn't even whispered it. He didn't seem scared to have the teacher phone his mom either. Before Kathy or Susan could answer George, Mrs. Darkman blew her red whistle 3 times. Phew, recess was over. It was time to go back to class. Cassie was very glad. She used to use her hands to wipe off some of the mud and then ran to line up. You okay? Jeremy whispered to Kathy. I guess. Kathy replied. George is a creep, you know that, Kathy nodded. But knowing that wasn't going to make George stop calling her the mud monster. He'd probably go at it all day unless Kathy couldn't have wishing that someone else would do something embarrassing that afternoon. Then maybe George Brennan would tease that kid instead. Chapter 2. This is for you, Kevin whispered to Kathy. He handed her a note. It was written on light blue paper and folded up real small. Kathy knew it was from Susan. Her notes always looked like that. If you have an answer for her, send it yourself, Kevin told Kathy. I don't want to get into trouble again. Kathy understood. Kevin sat at the desk right between Susan and Kathy. He always wound up passing notes from girl to girl. Yesterday, Mrs. Darkman had caught Kevin passing a note from Kevin to Susan. Kevin had to write a prosy note to Mrs. Darkman. Kathy folded the paper. Do you want to come over after school? The note read. Kathy scribbled her answer on the bottom of the note. No, thanks. I have to go home and change. Maybe tomorrow? Kathy tossed the paper over Kevin's head. It landed right on Susan's desk. Kathy crossed her finger, hoping Mrs. Darkman didn't see. Kathy rocked out. Mrs. Darkman didn't notice the flying note. She was too busy writing on the board. Okay, take out your pencils and math notebooks. Today we are going to review subtraction with borrowing, the teacher announced. Kathy gulped. Whenever Mrs. Darkman said the word review, it meant that she was going to ask some of the kids in the class to go to the board and solve the problem in front of everyone. Cassie slid down low in her chair, hoping Mrs. Darkman would notice her. She didn't want to be one of the kids who were corded on. It wasn't that Kathy couldn't do subtraction with borrowing. It was more that she hated being in front of the whole class. I will try one, Mrs. Darkman. Susan volunteered. Kathy sighed. Susan never worried about making a mistake in front of the whole class. She just liked being the center of attention. Kathy wishes she could be more like that. But today, Mrs. Darkman didn't ask Susan to come up to the board. She picked Mandy Banks, Jules Chanter, and Jeremy instead. Mandy went first. She whizzed through her problem. No surprise there. She was like a computer when it came to math. Next, it was Jules' turn. All right, Joe, Mrs. Drunkman said as Joe walked up to the board. What will you get when you subtract 105.2 from 901? The wrong answer, George joked out loud. Some kids in the class giggled. Joe blushed. Kathy thought it was really mean of George to joke around like that. Everyone knew Joe had a lot of trouble with math. Mrs. Darkman looked sternly over at George, but she smiled at Joe. Go ahead, she said to her. We'll do it together. When it was his turn, Jeremy took his time solving the subtraction problem. Cassie smiled. There was Jeremy, slow and steady like the tortoise in the story of the tortoise and the hare. Sometimes Jeremy's careful slowness could get kind of annoying, but not today. As long as Jeremy's up there, Mrs. Darkman wouldn't call on me, Kathy thought to herself. But eventually Jeremy did finish the problem, and he got the right answer as usual. Mrs. Darkman and smiled and wrote another math problem on the board. Let's do one more, she said. Cassie sunk the even roar in her chair. Her lip was practically resting on her desk, but it was No use, Mrs. Darkman thought her anyway. Kathy, will you solve this for us? The teacher asked. Kathy sighed. She stood up and slowly walked toward the board. Here comes the mud monster, the cat. Kathy heard George whisper as she walked past his desk. Kathy didn't want to walk past George, but she had no choice. He sat right in the front row, where Mrs. Darkman could keep an eye on him. Kathy reached the board and picked up a piece of yellow chalk. She opened her mouth to take a deep, calming breath, but instead of breathing in air, she let out a great big belch. It was the loudest burst she'd ever heard. A real record breaker. The other kids in the class began to laugh. Kathy burst to beat red. I'm sorry, she apologized to Mrs. Darkman. Kathy didn't want her teacher to think she'd done that on purpose. Out of the corner of her eye, Kathy could see George holding his nose. He was pretending to die from the smell of her breath. Kathy's stink up the classroom, George exclaimed. He laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair.